Happy Tuesday, happy Wednesday, happy whenever you're watching this. We have 2 lectures left, so this is one of our 2 remaining lectures. We will be discussing the epistles, the epistolary literature. The epistles are what most of the New Testament is made up of, and although the entirety of the New Testament is made up of writings from one person or group to a person or group, the epistles are their own literary genre that are specifically regarding that writing. So to start, we're going to do a little activity. I encourage you to pause the video once I've explained the activity. I'll give you a few seconds to do it, but I'm going to assume you're going to pause it to really get the full oomph of what it is that I'm saying. So I want you to take your phone we'll say your phone. Take your phone, open up the Messages app, go 6 people down in your messages, and scroll back a few swipes. And now I want you to imagine the reaction of a friend, or even better, imagine the reaction of a stranger if you were to hand your phone and have them start reading that text message thread. What would they read in the text that you're sharing? And what would they miss? What are the things that they don't understand in the texts? What are the reactions you might get from someone as they just drop in on a random text thread and jump into the conversation partially through? So do it. And now that you've done that, that's kind of what we're doing with the biblical literature. When we're reading the epistles, we're reading one interaction in a string of interactions. For example, if you look at Philemon, Philemon's a great example because it's a short book, but it's also a book that has a specific relational framework that's kind of laid out in the letter. So the parties in Philemon are Paul, the one who's writing, Onesimus, the slave, and Philemon, the slave owner. And those 3 parties, in the context of slave owner relationships, make the playing field almost for that letter. The stage. They set the stage for the letter. So based on the letter, that there are things that have happened before, that there are things that will happen after, and we're just getting a narrow glimpse into what it's like to we're just getting a narrow glimpse into what the relationship is like. That's the way it is for all of the letters to varying degrees. But as we look at the epistles today, we're going to need to keep that in mind, that we're getting a sliver of an interaction, but we're not getting the entire interaction. So with that being said, let's look at the epistles. So with that being said, there are a few things that are important to know about the epistles. And not just the epistles in general, but anytime you are reading an epistle, there is a helpful starting point of how to jump in. So first thing that you need to do, if you can, is you want to know the context. I know that we have said context is important for all of these. If you've heard that every single class period, that's because, well, context is important for all of these. So you're right in thinking that. But it's especially important when we're talking about the letters, because in reading the letters and in reading Paul's interactions with congregations, we're reading someone else's mail. And I would say I would interact with my wife differently than I would interact with Hugo, my dog, those are the two that I spend the most time with during quarantine. So they're the 2 examples that came into mind. But I'll interact with them differently, and because I interact with them differently, who I'm interacting with is important. So when you're reading the letters to 1 Corinthians, it's important to or the letter to the Corinthians, for example, 1 Corinthians, it's important to keep in mind the not just the context, but the specific people who he's interacting with. We'll take 1 Corinthians as an example here, just because it's one of the ones that I'm more familiar with. But you could do this with, you could do this with just about any letter that you're reading. In Corinth was an old, a very historical town in Greece. It's a very important place. It's a very important trade location. It's on the isthmus that connects kind of the weird peninsular Greece with the mainland Greece. So in doing that, in existing there, it's a really important spot for both land trade among Greece and also sea trade for the ships that don't want to go all the way around Greece. I guess I'm drawing in the air. I can do this. It's probably better if I don't draw Greece on here, just because I'm not too sure where that's going to lead us. But Corinth was on the isthmus, so it's a really important place, and it had existed, I think it was founded in 146 BC. So it had been around long before, but over time it was eventually destroyed. I want to say in 54 BC it was destroyed, and having been destroyed, it lay dormant for a little bit. But when the Roman Empire came into power, when specifically the Caesars came into power, they wanted to emphasize the trade in the region. So Corinth was a really, really important point. So they tried to repopulate the city of Corinth. The way that you repopulate a city like Corinth is, in the Roman system, there were very clear class distinctions, and you couldn't really move too much between those class distinctions. You repopulated Corinth by offering slaves, freedmen, former slaves, the opportunity to amass wealth and property by moving there. So by affording them the opportunity to elevate their status, there was an inherent incentive for the people to move to Corinth to be the people who otherwise have nothing. So you kind of have people on the bottom of society who are moving to Corinth with the expectation that if they do well, if they're successful, they can elevate their status. They can, by being powerful and by amassing wealth, they can raise and elevate their significance so they can move to higher social classes, and then their kids would grow up in those social classes. So the theme that you find in the book of 1 Corinthians is that Paul is writing to a community that is very aware of what it's like to try to raise your status and trying to fight with your neighbors, because only one of us can be the most significant. It's not remarkably different than the Southern California culture, specifically the Los Angeles culture, that you might compare to other areas. Or maybe now a better example would be the Bay Area, the Silicon Valley culture, where there's a lot of kind of going at one another and competitive nature with the attempt to raise myself up. So with this in mind, that the Corinthians are a very status-driven society, it makes sense that you would read things in the book of Corinthians like the foolish wisdom of the cross, where Jesus, instead of elevating himself, chose to serve others, and by serving others, he was ultimately elevated to a higher status. This theological theme is a theme that we find all over Paul's writings, but it's especially important to find in the book of Corinthians. And this theological statement is a vehicle that Paul gets at towards, for the Corinthians, unity. I'll edit that out. Unity. So 1 Corinthians is about unity and about the relationship of the people in the church with one another, about helping each other out, about serving one another. But it takes place in contrast to the city of Corinth, which is known for its ambition, I guess you could say. So that's something that if you read the book of 1 Corinthians, you might think the Corinthians were some weird people. And they were some weird people, but the letter that Paul is writing is not just about, hey, don't do this, hey, don't do that, but it's about how the Corinthians should be careful of the way they act because unity. So unity is a guiding principle for that. That's one of the reasons why it's helpful to keep in mind context. Again, you can do that with any of the letters. You can do that with any of the writings, but 1 Corinthians is the one that I am most familiar with. So that's one of the things to do. Another helpful thing to do in reading the letters is read it all in one sitting. We've said that before for the Gospels, but it's easy to become so focused on certain specific passages that we lose track of the big picture. But these were initially meant to be read in one sitting, in one go. So if you can read it in one sitting, it should help you pay attention to the important stuff and the stuff that is supposed to be important based on the letter. If you have the ability to, go on Bible Gateway or something and take out the subheadings, just use the verse numbers and try to outline the letter yourself. You don't need to do it every half verse, but you can say, oh, I noticed that these sentences all get at this theme, so I would put that here, and then he moves into this section. But by outlining it yourself, that gives you the freedom to not just take what other interpreters are saying, but allows you to have some agency in the interpretive process. So that's it's interesting how you'll find new information that you never thought of before when you start categorizing information as you go. And then just one helpful reminder as we begin talking about this. This is a very important reminder, so I'm going to erase all of this to give this front and center. But this is a rule that we use for all of our interpretation. A text cannot mean what it did not mean to its original authors or readers or audience. What it A text cannot mean what it did not mean to its original author or audience. And on one hand, we want to hold that loosely because some of theology is finding meaning in the text that we maybe didn't already find in there. But what I'm trying to say is that we can't read the book of 1 Corinthians and say, holy cow, I can't believe that Paul knew that in our economy, the best way to raise our status is to actually sell everything, to lose everything, to go bankrupt, and that's a way that you can get everyone to pay attention to you and use your social capital to then, I don't know, obviously creating a terrible example, but Paul wasn't trying to say things that he didn't have the philosophical framework to say yet. Paul wasn't talking about capitalism because capitalism did not exist yet. So therefore, that's not what Paul was going. It's not saying capitalism is bad, but it's just to say that a text cannot mean what it did not originally mean to its author or audience. Sound good? All right, then with that being said, we'll look at a few of the different forms of letters, and then I want to close with a question for reflection that we can bring back in for our discussion time on Thursday. So there's a distinction that we can make. We've said epistles, we've said letters, but an epistle is a public letter. So an epistle would be something that, for example, we're at the end of our fiscal year in the Church of the Nazarene in Southern California. So April 1st is the start of a new fiscal year. At the end of every fiscal year, there is a letter that is written to the community that is emailed out to everyone to let everyone know this is how we did financially, this is what we expected, this is what ultimately came to fruition, this is what we're looking forward to next year. Just a simple email newsletter so that way everyone knows what's going on. But in the ancient world, you couldn't send an email out to everyone. So a letter would be written and then everyone would gather and someone would read the letter aloud for everyone to hear. That letter is written not with a personal nature, but that letter is written towards anyone who wants to hear. You might find in the book of Hebrews is a little bit more epistolary, which means that it was written to be read, but it was probably written to be read in one community and then passed on to another community and then read there and then passed on to another community and read there. So it doesn't necessarily have as much of a specific connection with the people that you'll find in 1 Corinthians. So the contrast is the letter, and letters were private. Letters were written to a specific person in the ancient world. Now, the letters in the New Testament kind of break this distinction a little bit, because even the private letters were read publicly, and the public proclamations of the epistles were made with specific context in mind. But if you hear epistle or if you hear letter, that's kind of what we're getting at. So it's not a perfect distinction, but for the last 150 years in the church, this has been a distinction that was made. So just so you know, if you find this information, that's kind of the reasoning for the distinction. There's a clear structure to the letters, and I want you to know specifically what that structure is. It's a helpful starting point. You'll find in a letter there's an opening. The opening is kind of the greeting. It says, I won't give you an example. Open up to any letter written by Paul specifically, but you can also find it written by some of the other authors. There's an opening, typically, hey, how's it going? My name's Paul. I've been meaning to write to you for a while. Followed by a thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is exactly what it sounds like. It's the moment where the writer says, I'm so grateful for you. I'm so grateful for hearing this. And it's not something that was necessarily present in the other ancient letter writing that you find. So this is a fairly, not that Thanksgiving is a Christian thing, but the incorporation of Thanksgiving at the early part of the letter is a distinctly Christian framework of the letter based on the letter formulas that we have. After the Thanksgiving is the body. The body is kind of the theological statements that we'll find. It's the point that is trying to be made, followed by the parenesis. I'm going to make sure I spelled that right. Yeah, I nailed that. So the parenesis is kind of the praxis. It's, okay, with that in mind, what do we do? What am I hoping for you? I'm not just writing to tell you some really cool ideas and how they fit together, but these ideas have implications for you as a community. So you should do this, or why are you doing this, or what's wrong with you? Who told you this was a good idea? And that is brought together in the closing. These are generally the 5 elements that you'll find in the New Testament letters or the New Testament epistles. And I want to talk about this right here, the body and the parenesis, because Paul, I'm going to say Paul, it's not because Paul is the only one who wrote in the New Testament. There are many other voices in the New Testament. It's not even because Paul is the most featured author in the New Testament. Luke has more content in the New Testament than Paul does. However, I've spent most of my time reading Paul, and I have a great appreciation for Paul. It's funny, early on I didn't have a great appreciation for Paul, but in increased study of Paul, I've learned to appreciate him even more. And we're going to talk a little bit about Paul with the Stendhal reading that's coming up, and also with some of the dialogue questions that I'm hoping we can get to on Thursday. So I'm speaking about Paul. This framework is generally true in the New Testament. It's not perfect, but it's generally true. But Paul follows this pretty closely. And Paul does some pretty remarkable stuff with that. I love the body of the letters, because the body is where Paul does some of the theology. That's where, like in Philippians 2, Paul is writing and says, let the same mind be in you as is in Christ Jesus. And then he almost bursts into song. Philippians 2, 5 through 11 is known as the canonic hymn, which it's so well formulated and different from the rest of the hymn that a lot of scholars, it's widely accepted by scholars that Paul is not writing that, but he's quoting that. he's like invoking a song that everyone already knows. It's probably a part of that was a part of their liturgy, like their worship liturgy. As they were together, they would say, Christ Jesus did not consider being equal with God as something to be grasped, and kind of follow into that liturgy. So Paul is quoting the liturgy that people would have already known, and he's probably adding a quote or two. But he just starts saying, and we all know this is true theologically. So I love, on one hand, the beautiful theological message of that Paul didn't consider equality with, or that Jesus, I don't know if I was mistaking Paul for Jesus for a while there, just on that last one, but I apologize if I was. But Jesus did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped, but instead gave his life, taking on the form of a slave, and was sacrificed on a cross. So that element of sacrifice and then being raised up because of the sacrificial nature, that is a huge, important theological idea that I love. But if you look at Philippians 3 and Philippians 4, Paul isn't just saying that so that way people think he's smart. He's not, oh, look at that theology I just did. Everyone impressed with me? But Paul is saying, you know this to be true. And then in Philippians 3, Paul is saying, and look at me. I sacrificed this. I suffered this. I'm in jail. Look at all that I've experienced. But I don't consider that bad. I consider that victory. But again, it's not just to tell a story, but it's to say, so that you, so the parenesis, so that you might live this out. I think Prisca and Aquila, am I correct on that? I'm probably not correct on that. I apologize. But there are a couple of people that he's writing to and is asking them to do a specific thing in the midst of the community. And the reasoning is the body. He's given his argument in the body, and then he gives the implications of that argument in the parenesis. So essentially, Paul is preaching. Paul is doing some of the things that we've talked about, where you're exegeting the passage and you're telling your people what it looks like to live that out. Not that it's a practical application, because you know how I feel about practical application, but that it has implications. It has a practice. So I just think it's a wonderful example that we have in the person of Paul, that he's doing theology. He's always doing theology, but the theology he's doing has real world implications and goes beyond strictly an exercise in theology. So these are some of the key elements of our letters that we'll find. Now I want to power through a few things real quick, because they're rhetorical keys. These are ways that the writer of the letters or the writer of the epistles would try to make a point and emphasize that point. One of the ways people would make that point is by lists. There are so many lists that you find, and I know it might be tempting to just, like when you're reading Galatians 5 and you come across the fruits of the Spirit, to say, oh, list of bad things. I'm just going to remember that's a list of bad things. But it's important to remember what the list is of. So there are vice lists. The vice lists do more than just say, think general bad thoughts. But it's the way that a specific list of vices is built out to create a robust definition of what the evil or the sin that the writer is talking about is. There's also virtue lists that you'll find. There's lists of circumstances, like when Paul talks about all the suffering and pain that he's been through, he lists off all the different examples of how he's experienced pain. There's lists of rules for behavior. It's the way that I expect you to live, to create a robust understanding of the Christian life rather than just say one theological idea or one example and entrust other people to live that out. So Lists are great ways to elaborate upon definitions. There are also proverbs that you'll find. And that doesn't mean the book of Proverbs, but it's a short, memorable saying that sometimes, I imagine more often than not, the writer isn't creating them, but is referencing them. Like saying, two in the hand's worth one in the bush, is a way of saying or one in the hand's worth two in the bush. See how well Proverbs can really make their point? But one in the hand is worth two in the bush is a way of saying that one that you already have is worth more than two potential options. So, but if I were to quote that, I wouldn't want you to say, "Oh wow, look how smart Mackenzie is! What a great proverb! What a great proverb that is!" I would hope that you would further get the idea based on your experience. There's also confessional statements. Confessional statements are kind of boiled down, very, very concise theological statements that the church would confess to be true. Let me find an example of what one of those would be. I'm back. So one example would be Romans 10, verse 9. In Romans 10, verse 9, the statement is, "Because if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and in your heart you have faith that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." That might just be Paul writing, but it might also be falling back on statements and phrases that people would have already known. So again, working with prior knowledge is an important part of reading these letters and epistles. You can also find hymns. I gave you one example of that. That's Philippians 2, 5 through 11. Another example would be diatribe. A diatribe is an angry argument, you might say. Romans 6 says, "You foolish Romans," I guess that's Galatians. In Galatians, Paul says, "You foolish Galatians." But there's kind of an angry statement where Paul's like, I'm so frustrated and angry with you. And he argues and argues. And sometimes a diatribe, like in Romans 6, will imagine responses to the statements only to shut those things down. What then are we to say? Should we go on sinning that grace may abound? By no means. There's kind of a anticipation of a response only to cut that response down. And that's a diatribe that you'll find. Two more, there's word chains. Word chains, like I believe it's Romans 5. Suffering produces perseverance. Romans 5, verse 3. But not only that, we even take pride in our problems because we know that trouble produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. This hope doesn't put us to shame because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts through Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So creates a connection. This word chain creates connection. That is how we get from trouble to hope. So that way those two become a little bit closer in connection. And then finally, captatio benevolentia. Captatio benevolentia is where the writer charitably assumes knowledge on behalf of the listeners. So that would be like when I'm teaching and I say, "Oh, but you already know that because you are so smart and wise and you have learned that in this class and this class and this class. So of course you understand that. And because you understand that, this thing is also true." So it's where I assume that knowledge on your behalf, but not just to assume the knowledge, but because by saying you're smart because you know this, if you're going to disagree with me and say, actually, I don't know that, then you would also be cutting away the praise that I had just given you. Maybe our teacher-student relationship is a bad example, but that's something where you might say, because you're so smart, and smart people know what a wise investment is, you're going to give me $5. You then would say, either I give you $5 and you called me smart, or I don't give you $5 and now I'm suddenly not smart anymore. So I lose something if I don't agree with you. So that's just a rhetorical device to get the listeners, to get the readers to be on the same page with the writer. So again, there are plenty of others. This was the writers of the New Testament. They weren't the best writers in the world, but they were trained rhetorically in the same way that a lot of the higher level Greek people, higher level Greeks would be trained. So it's not that in Paul you find the best Greek that could ever be written. But in Paul you find someone who's trained in how to argue, knows how to argue well, and is practicing that rhetorical strategy in the way that he writes. And you can find that to the degree that he uses some of the rules and other literary devices. So now in closing, just a reflection that I wrote up here. It was going to take me a long time to write up here, so I wrote off camera, and now I've started to record. But this question is one that will guide our interpretation of any biblical text, but I think more than any other texts, it will guide our interpretation of the New Testament epistles and letters. Those are really difficult texts to interpret because sometimes the practice seems so straightforward. It seems really obvious to say, oh, we should do this or not do this, or it's plain to see in the text that Paul says A, so why would we do anything other than A? But the problem is that sometimes it's not plain that Paul says A, and sometimes even if Paul said A, that was because Paul was saying A to a specific context, and now in a different context, Paul might have said B or C or even D. So this question should haunt us as we read. Where and how do my particular beliefs, culture, upbringing, and commitments influence my interpretation? Where and how do these things influence my interpretation? I don't know if you know this, but I am a Nazarene. And I've tried to be open and honest with y'all about that. And it's not because it's a secret, embarrassing thing that I don't want to tell anyone and I will secretly tell you. I will be very upfront about it, but it's because I know that being a Nazarene is some of the theological commitments that I have, some of the upbringing, not growing up, and some of the culture and beliefs. So Nazarenedom is part of my answer to where my beliefs, culture, upbringing, and commitments are. And because those are my commitments, that's going to influence the way that I read the text. I don't want them to totally color the way that I read the text, but it's impossible to achieve any sort of interpretive objectivity. So I consider it a service to you that I tell you I am a Nazarene when I'm doing these things, when I'm interpreting, when I'm trying to draw out the meaning in the text. That doesn't mean that you would disagree with me on what the meaning in the text is just because you're not a Nazarene. But I want you to know that when I see holiness, my alarms go off, because I have been taught to read that holiness means a sanctified life, the way that we live in response to the resurrection, and it's God's power moving in us. It's the Holy Spirit. It's to be set apart from the rest of the world, to participate in God's recreation of the world. All of those things go off when I hear the word holiness. That might not be what goes off for you. You might not even notice the word holiness based on your particular upbringing and demographic. So all that to say, these affect the way that I read Paul. They affect the way that I like some writers and I don't like some writers. Not even Nazarenedom, but just my beliefs and some of my theological commitments are why I really like the book of Mark and why the book of John is easier to keep at a distance for me. So I'm aware of that. It doesn't mean I can throw out the book of John, but it means that I just have to be honest where I'm coming from and why these things are my commitments. We might not even know what our commitments are or what our beliefs are. But this is especially important as we read the writings of the New Testament letters and epistles, because I think often we are unaware of our upbringing as a unique experience. I would often take my education as the right education rather than a specific education stream, but also our commitments. I think sometimes we can be unaware of the fact that it's harder to read things when we have skin in the game. For example, when I read 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35, which let me read this to you right now. Let me read it to you because this is something that's going to guide some of our discussion on Thursday. When I read 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35, where it says, the woman should be quiet during the meeting. They are not allowed to talk. Instead, they need to get under control, just as the law says. If they want to learn something, they should ask their husbands at home. It is disgraceful for a woman to talk during the meeting. So I have commitments when I'm reading that. On one hand, my commitment is to the Nazarene Church, which has been a part of has been affirming of women in ministry since its inception in 1908. There's a fun story. I can tell you about that story if you're interested. I love telling that story. So on one hand, the Church of the Nazarene is supportive of women in ministry. On the other hand, if women are allowed to preach, I am a man, that means more people are allowed to preach. So you could make the case that my services are less in demand when everyone is allowed to preach instead of just about 50% of the population is allowed to preach. Now, I say that to be straightforward, and I hope that comes across in a video better than it sounds like it's coming across in my mind as I say it. Because I am supportive of women in ministry. There is a classroom of people, or there would be a classroom of people right now hearing me say these things, who are training to study and to teach the Bible. And I want you to know I'm in your corner, I'm supportive of you, and I'm on your team. But I also need to be honest with the fact that the way we interpret this doesn't just have effects on other people. When I read it, I need to know this has effects on me and the way that I read the text. And these commitments might be competing in some ways. So the question becomes, which of these commitments wins out? And ultimately, the way that I read it, the bulk of Scripture testifies to the fact that, first of all, that God is empowering women to do ministry just as much as God is empowering men to do ministry. And on the other hand, 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35, and some of the other texts that you read, like I think 1 Timothy is one of the examples. I'm not too familiar, but those are pretty anecdotal, pretty specific, pretty contextual compared to the overwhelming arc of Scripture where Jesus seems to invite women into ministry to follow him. So, all that being said, when we read the letters and the epistles, we need to be aware of what our personal standing ground is as we read them, and be aware of why these things might be important and relevant to us, or why they might not seem as important or relevant to us. So a question for us to reflect on is this question of, what does it mean to be a woman in ministry? Or what does it mean to be someone who is supportive of women in ministry? Or what does it mean to be someone who is an advocate for women in ministry? I know we have people from different backgrounds in this class, so I'm excited to talk about some of that on Thursday. And I'm really excited to hear the experiences of some of the women in the class, of what their experience was like, what your experience was like growing up in the church or coming to the church at a later age, and what we have seen or witnessed or experienced in terms of teachers who are women in our framework, in our time in the church. So I'm excited to talk about that. I really look forward to it. I know that that's a fairly specific thing that we'll be talking about, but the way we have that conversation will be hugely important for the way we interpret all of the writings of the New Testament. So don't think that our discussion is strictly a discussion of women in ministry. However, of all of the things that we could talk about, I feel like that is a really important thing for us to talk about. So we're going to talk about that on Thursday. We are also going to read the Stendhal. Did I say that 3 different ways or the same way each time? I don't know. We're going to read that article and discuss it a little bit in our time together. And I think that is all that I have for you. Should we talk about... You can't answer me. You're not going to give me any feedback. Okay, yeah, one more thing, last thing. And this will also have implications in apocalyptic literature. So when we're reading these writings in the church, there are a couple of things that are in competing... There are other competing commitments that the writers have. One of those things is historical precedents. So the writers are establishing a precedent and they're interacting within a historical precedent of the way things have always been. So one of the tensions that the writers are being pulled in is the tension of doing things the way that we have done them. The other tension that they find, the other tension that we can see, is eschatological preference. Eschatological preference is the thing that is, or I guess these are bad arrows. Let me redraw these real quick. So historical precedence, which is the way things have existed from the beginning of time to now, continuing to act in accordance with the laws, with the restrictions, with the rules, with the practices we're handed. The other one is the eschatological preference, which is founded in the resurrection. The resurrection is the moment when that future end time thing that we were all anticipating to happen someday, it already happened. So we have that future that we're anticipating, or I guess we have that future that we're anticipating that is reaching back into the present and is changing the present to look more like the future, to look more like the eschaton or the final days. So this is the tension that the churches find themselves in and the writers find themselves in. On one hand, they're balancing the historical precedents of what it's like to be a faithful church, but on the other hand, they're living in radically transformative new ways, because the church is not called to be the same thing it always was, but the church is called to be the embodiment of the resurrection in the distance that has broken into the present today. So these are important things to keep in mind. Hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about that on Thursday as well, but I know we only have limited time on Thursday. I definitely believe I was able to keep the lecture a little bit shorter today, which is good. I hope this was a good experience for you, but I will see you on Thursday. Thanks.